Hi everyone. So this is part two of shielding. In the first part, we went over some more generic situations of just how to deal with some of the shielding equations, how different energies, different materials factor in to how you calculate the effectiveness of a shield. Also, just how to account for distance in your shielding, because as we say in health physics, time, distance, and shielding are what you use to keep your doses low. So if you can manipulate time and shield or distance and shielding, then you have two valuable strategies for keeping doses low, keeping people safe, keeping areas free of high levels of radiation. So before we jump into Linacs and the real big machines, we'll just discuss basic general X-ray rooms, GenRad, mammo, dental X-rays. There are some basic requirements. These machines put out much lower intensity radiation. They put out much lower energy radiation. So a lot of times you can get away with just having the actual building materials themselves. They'll attenuate the beam enough to create a safe level. Gypsum board for drywall has some degree of shielding potential. But that's usually in conjunction with larger distances. And there would still be a console where the actual X-ray operator resides, and that would have to be shielded. But for our situation, we have much smaller rooms because we're dealing with, just city buildings. So we typically use 1/16 of an inch of lead. It's a very, very thin sheet of lead, but it is more than sufficient to stop the amount and the energy of radiation that we're dealing with in a GenRad room. There's going to be a lot of scatter, so that further lowers the energy, that further dissipates any sort of direct beam of radiation. So you want a console. Console will not be completely enclosed, but it's to be designed in such a way that there's no direct line of sight between the X-ray machine itself and the console. There needs to be designed that there's enough, interactions of those photons that the intensity getting into that console will be very, very low, to the point where the operator could be there all day, every day, and not get a dangerous level of radiation. For something like CT, you're going to have a higher intensity, so there's going to be more radiation present. It's also going to be a little bit higher radiation, so that means you typically need a little bit more shielding. So that's where you see about an 1/8 inch of lead. That's, again, a general rule of thumb for how we handle our rooms. You could design a CT room, again, that has a large enough distance between the bore of the CT and occupied areas that you can maybe get away with less lead or no lead. But for our purposes, we need to rely on lead, again, because we have very small rooms for the most part. And then if you think about PET CT, so that's a CT in there that you have to account for, but you're also going to have patients day in, day out that are loaded up with F-18. That's a positron emitter. So you're going to have some high energy decay photons to deal with as well. And so that's where you get, I think, a 1/4 inch of lead is adequate in that situation. But again, it comes down to distances and the surrounding rooms, who's, actually using those rooms. Are they occupied? Are they closets? Are they hallways? So that gets into a little bit more of the room by room design, as opposed to these sort of rules of thumb that we have for diagnostic X-ray and CT. And then we get to Linacs. Linacs are where we know there's going to be very, very intense, very, very directional, very, very high energy photon sources, radiation sources. So we need to account for that in a number of different ways. And so when you're looking at designing a Linac vault, you really take into account two separate factors. A Linac vault will rotate in a single plane. It rotates, in full 360 degrees, but in a single plane. So that plane that's covered by that rotation, accounting for any spread of the beam that happens, is what's considered the primary beam path. So this is going to get the direct beam that's passing through the patient, passing through the table that they're on, and needs to be absorbed or stopped by some very robust shielding in order to not pass through that shielding and then go irradiate something on the other side. So this is going to be, if you look at mock-ups or drawings of vaults, you'll see that very often this primary beam, there's a bump out that they call it, just an area where there is significantly more shielding. or if you don't have the benefit of adding additional space, you would just have more of a higher quality shielding. You'd have areas that have significantly more lead in the walls than other areas in the room. But that's because the primary beam will have a higher intensity of radiation, and it will have photons that are up to and including the max energy of the machine. So that's, that is a little bit more of a challenge than the secondary shielding, which only gets scattered radiation. So essentially that means that the radiation has to have interacted with something before it is incident on any secondary shielding. So what does that mean? That means that there's not that very high intensity field. It's still a very high intensity radiation field, but it's not that directional beam shooting straight at a target. There will be that one interaction will serve to lower the energy of the radiation that's incident on those secondary shields, and just also make it much less of a focused beam. So there you can get a lot, you can use less shielding, essentially. And there's equations to figure out exactly how much. But we say, again, another rule of thumb is about 1,000 times less than the primary beam. And we'll discuss that a little bit more, I think, in the next slide. Yeah, so these are the two equations when it comes down to LINAC design and knowing how much shielding you need to put in place. So we look at the equations. What are the actual factors that go in to deciding this transmission factor? So the transmission factor B is essentially just the original beam over the beam the beam that gets through the shielding over the original beam. So it's essentially what is getting through the shielding. It's the inverse of what is being stopped by the shielding. It's what's getting through. So it's that factor is the degree that we need to reduce that original beam in order to be in compliance with certain design goals. And that takes us to our first variable. It's important that you know what each of these variables represents, because they are all the important considerations that you need to take into account for designing, a LINAC vault, essentially. So you have, the first is going to be your dose limit that you're interested in. So you want to know what level of radiation outside of this vault is acceptable. And that's going to change depending on what is outside the walls. Remember, if we go back to, surveys and all that, you have two primary types of locations when you're looking at it from a radiation safety program. You have controlled and you have uncontrolled. In controlled areas, it's assumed that there are only radiation workers present. They are wearing dosimeters. They are subject to the annual, 5,000 millirem per year annual limit. So the design goals for that will be different than, say, a public restroom or a public hallway, because that will be subject to the 100 millirem per year design limit for, or just dose limit for a member of the public. So that's going to have a big, that's going to play a big role in how much shielding you need, because you need to know what your ultimate goal is. Of course, distance is always going to come into play. So, it's the same as with inverse squares. You need to account for how far away your point of interest is from that isocenter of the LINAC, because that dictates how intense that radiation would be unshielded at the location of interest. So you pretend that there's no shielding there, but you're still going to get a reduction if you have a large amount of distance between your point of interest and the isocenter. So again, that's something we deal with at MSK because we have small LINAC vaults, at least in main campus. So because we have those small distances, we're generally going to need more shielding. And so that's what we account for. Okay, so the bottom, we say this B equals PD squared over what? That's kind of the, the casual way of saying it, but it's PD squared over WUT. So we need to understand also what these factors are. W is the workload. That's essentially just the radiation that is going to be output from this machine. And that generally coincides with how many patients are on the machine, how much radiation per patient. That's how you tally it up. You say, okay, well, there's going to be 30 patients treated per week. They each get a dose of this, and then you just tally up all the patients, and you get some milliamp minutes per week or rad per week Generally, it's per week. You could also have per year. You just got to be careful to know your units for the workload. But that's just really the radiation that this machine is putting out at the ISO center. So that's going to be, again, a very important factor in figuring out how much you need to shield, because you need to know how much radiation is actually coming out of the machine. If it's on all day, every day, that's a big difference than, a couple of minutes of beam on time a week or a day. It's a drastic difference. We know that these machines aren't on all day, every day. They're on to treat patients and maybe a little bit of QA work. So that's an important piece of the puzzle to know. The use factor. So the use factor reflects, it's not the workload, it's different from the workload. This reflects the fact that you have a beam that moves. So for the primary beam, it can be pointed only in one direction at one time. So if you are thinking about a room that's located, in a certain spot in the primary beam, it's located next to the Linac vault in the primary beam, but it's, on the same floor to the side of it. Well, if 3/4 of the time the beam is pointed up, down, and in the other direction, then you're not going to be dealing with that primary beam. So that U factor accounts for the fact that only a percentage of the time of the beam on time, only a percentage of that workload is directed at the target of interest, at the location of interest that you're trying to figure out. And that's why you'll see with scatter, that use factor is missing, because scatter is present no matter where the beam's pointing. But the primary beam will only be pointed at a certain primary shield a certain percentage of the time. And then finally, the occupancy factor. So all these are, easy to, W goes with workload, U goes with use, T is for occupancy. The way that I was taught to remember this, kind of the humorous way, is that you think of T, you can think of toilet, and a toilet can be occupied. So when you're struggling and think, what is T? Why can't I think of what T is? Try to think of that. Hopefully that jogs your memory. But T is just acknowledging the fact that certain spaces are not occupied all the time. When you have a beam on time, you have, you have the console. That's going to probably be occupied all the time that the beam is on. You would hope that if there's someone turning on the beam, there's someone behind the console actually controlling that beam and overseeing the actual therapy. But if you have a janitor's closet that also happens to butt up against Linac vault, that's going to be occupied far, far less. So you could take credit for that. That occupancy factor serves to reduce your need for shielding. If your Linac vault is surrounded by only hallways or only spaces where people are not occupied 24/7, then you can take credit for that, and you can require less shielding, because you know that there's not going to be someone there all day, every day, for every single treatment that is run on this machine. So looking at from trying to solve these equations, you're going to have to be given all this information. You're going to be given a workload. You're going to be given a use factor. You're going to be given an occupancy factor. It's not something you have to memorize. There may be some basic calculation regarding the workload. If you're given a certain number of patients and an average treatment per patient, that's something that you can multiply together to figure out a workload. And that's what we'll work through when we're going through these problems. The equation down here, I pointed out that it had no use factor. This is for scattered radiation. And again, we talked about that 1,000 factor, the scattered radiation being 1,000 times less intense than the primary. And that comes from the regulation that says, it's a QA regulation for Linacs that says that the primary beam, the leakage coming from the head of the Linac, there's a very intense radiation source where that electron beam hits that target, that tungsten target. I think it's tungsten target, and creates a non-directional photon beam that's shielded in almost every direction except for that primary beam that is used to treat patients. So there's very, very heavy shielding, and regulations actually require that the leakage from the head is less than 0.1% of the primary beam intensity. So that's where that 1,000 comes from. 0.1% means that it would be 1,000 times less intense than the primary beam. So you're allowed to take credit for that in terms of scatter, because this is going to be radiation that's incident on every other shield besides the primary. I mean, it'll be incident on the primary beam as well, or on the primary shielding, but the primary beam will never hit the secondary shielding, whereas scatter will hit every shielding. So you can get away with doing a little bit less shielding in the secondary areas, because all you're going to be dealing with is scatter, which is theoretically much less intense than the primary beam. So yeah, so you can see that, you know, there's a lot of going through individual spaces around around the vault. You have to factor in every single room that touches this LINAC vault, and then do this equation and figure out. So you want to, you know, you want to design it conservatively, but then you also have conflicting interests of hospital administration saying, hey, you know, lead's expensive. Like, is there any way you can get away with less? Or you have construction coming to you and saying, I can't fit 3 meters of concrete here. You need to come up with something else. And so you go back to the drawing board. You say, okay, well, I can use different materials, or maybe, you know, maybe this hallway really isn't occupied a half of the time. Maybe it's occupied an eighth of the time. Or there's lots of every single one of those individual factors can be modified a little bit if you run into a situation where you need to, what they say, sharpen your pencil and figure out a way to be a little bit less conservative, but still be confident that you are not, you know, playing loose and fast with what can be very intense radiation sources. So going back to that P, that was the first variable that we discussed, those design goals. So these are pretty static. You know, they changed a little while back. There was a guidance document that came out that said that, okay, you know, the controlled area, you have radiation workers here. So they're allowed to get 5,000 millirem per year. So what does that break down to a week? Weekly, that could be 100 millirem a week you're able to get and be in compliance with dose limits. So as long as you're below 100 millirem a week. But then, you know, as time has gone on, people have thought, okay, well, just because you can get 5,000 millirem doesn't mean you want to get 5,000 millirem. That's sort of the concept of as low as reasonably achievable. You can get that dose. You can get the dose without reporting it to your regulator, but you really don't want to. You know, there is risk involved with that dose year after year after year. And another big factor is you want to design these vaults so that you can accommodate pregnant staff. You know, if someone declares a pregnancy, you don't want to take them away from the machine because that's their job. So in addition to just wanting to protect all your staff, you also have a regulatory obligation to keep doses to a pregnant worker to 500 millirem over the course of pregnancy. So, you know, those are two very good reasons why the design goals have been reduced to 10 millirem per week and 500 millirem roughly per year for controlled areas. Now, uncontrolled areas, the allowed limit for a member of the public was reduced to 100 millirem. I guess it used to be 500 millirem. This is going way back. But, you know, that equates to, you know, roughly 50 weeks in a year. So divide 100 by 50, and that gives you that 2 millirem per week. You also have that additional requirement where any uncontrolled area cannot have more than 2 millirem in any 1 hour. So that's another reason where that 100 millirem per year comes from. So really, I want you to try to think about this. You know, this is just one more thing you have to remember for a quiz, for a test. But if you remember your dose limits and the appropriate dose limits, then you can always calculate these values based off of the annual limits. You can calculate your weekly design goal based off the annual limits. So if you just remember that we're designing for ALARA principles and for pregnant staff, so that's that 500 millirem limit, and the 100 millirem limit for a member of the public. So uncontrolled area means that the public will be walking around, and you need to make sure that there's no more than 2 millirem per week. So hopefully if you forget them, you can still try to, you know, go back and think, okay, well, what are the annual limits? Roughly 50 weeks in a year. Okay, that might jog your memory and be able to push through. The occupancy factor, T, that I talked about, these are actually established. You can't really, you'd have to have a really good argument to adjust them because these are handed down by guidance documents, by not regulators, but professional groups that you would have a hard time arguing with the regulator that for why you change these values unless you had a very good reason. Like a toilet that is, out of service, always locked, completely unoccupied, then maybe you can give a much lower occupancy value. But again, this serves to acknowledge that certain areas are going to have not full occupancy, with the sole exception of the console. But if you have a toilet, what are the odds that the person in the toilet is the same person for every treatment for a year? It's just not going to happen unless someone's trying to skip out on work or something. But it's, a hallway. People are walking by. Yeah, you might stop in a hallway and talk on your phone for a while, but the odds of you doing that all day, every day, it just doesn't happen. So that's why these factors allow you to be a little bit more realistic. They're a little bit more true to life factors to, again, make it so you don't over design on the neck vault, because the regulators don't want you to go so far beyond what you need to. They're interested in keeping things realistic as well. So these are just ways that let you lower your requirements based on real world use of these spaces. So and then we get that transmission factor. Great, you have that B value of the level of radiation you need versus what is presently there. So that B value is this B value right here. And so what do you do with that? Well, you use this equation to equate that B value to the number of half value layers that you require in order to actually get to that lowered level. So this is the equation that we use. We'll run through examples explaining all of this, but essentially that B value is only half of the puzzle. You need to actually know what to do with that B value, and then that's where you get number of half value layers. And from that number of half value layers, that's a generic value that you can then decide, okay, well, I want to use concrete. So I have a number of half value layers. I know the half value layer for concrete at this energy machine, and then you can actually calculate a thickness that you need for that shielding. Or if you want to use lead, you can look up the half value layer for lead for that energy machine, and then you can calculate how much lead you need. It works for any material if you get the number of half value layers needed. You can also do it with 10th value layers. Remember I said that we're not going to be doing that though, because that is just, it involves log, and that's just something we haven't covered at all in this class. It's unnecessary to bring other math into this. We're more comfortable, more familiar with natural log, with the natural log of 2. So that's what all of our problems are going to be based around, number of half value layers, and manipulating that to get the information that we need. And then finally, all this is theoretical, all this is design, but all this stuff's got to get built. It's going to be built by people. It's going to be built by people that can make mistakes, people that are having a bad day and say, oh, I don't, I'm going to do what I want, not what the design says. My old teacher used to talk about how, it wasn't uncommon for things to just, the construction workers are working, pouring concrete, take a lunch break. They got a bunch of garbage. Just you're pouring a 3-meter thick wall. Just throw your garbage in the concrete. But if you do that enough, you get some void spaces that can unfortunately not be shielding. And so when that's built, you're doing your survey and you get hot spots, and it's like, okay, well, why is that? This was designed right, and it's okay, well, it wasn't implemented to the design. So there's a million reasons why your design can fall short, why during construction your design doesn't pan out 100%. So it's super important to actually take a meter and do these surveys. They have to be done by what's considered a qualified expert. Believe it or not, I'm not a qualified expert in the eyes of New York State. So I have to have all these surveys that I do personally signed off by a licensed medical physicist. It's a process to get your license, but honestly, in how it pans out in real life is just you do the survey, you get it reviewed by a higher up, and they sign off on it. But yeah, so it's taken very seriously, these surveys. They're going to be one of the first things that an inspector looks at when they come in for a LINAC inspection. We kind of have, you know, perpetual surveys in the regard that we have workers constantly around these machines, constantly around these vaults, and those dosimeters are also read very closely. So we would, beyond our one-time survey of the vaults, we also have ongoing information that lets us know that the people that are using these machines are not at any sort of serious risk from radiation. And so we'll save the examples for when we're together in class. We'll run through some in the presentation. I got some more examples for homework. We'll just keep running through them until you guys feel comfortable with them. So I will see you guys bright and early at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Okay, take care.